Hey everyone, this is for all the grade 12 HLs. This is all to help you prepare for the IO that's coming up later this year. What I've decided to do is do a practice IO for Slaughterhouse 5. Could I?
Yeah.
For this old bad boy. So if you're in 12.5, 12.8, or 12.2, you should be familiar with this book. Mr. Patrick and I have decided to do a mock IO. I will be the student, and Mr. Patrick will be my teacher.
Yes.
So
since you're so immature and young, I decided to be the teacher for this. Someone has to lead the way. So.
Makes sense. So I believe we're going to do all three parts of the IO. I'm going to read an excerpt from Slaughterhouse 5 that Mr. Patrick has provided me, and then I will do a presentation on that, and then he will ask me questions based on my presentation, and then we'll get to part 3, which is not literature-based and strictly IB themes. So do you have anything else you want to add?
No, this is an actual simulation, though, where Mr. Adam has never seen this excerpt.
Never, yeah.
And
but I have read the book.
He has read the book. Well, obviously, they all have. Well, hopefully.
We'll hope so.
We hope so. And he's only going to get 20 minutes, and he doesn't know. We have not rehearsed this at all. So Here we go.
All right.
20 minutes starts now, after he sees it. Okay, so we are ready to start. Adam just had 20 minutes, and now he's going to do his presentation. You can't see it, but in front of him, he has a stopwatch. So he's going to be able to see the time when he's presenting. He's trying to keep this between 3 and 4 minutes. So without further ado, let's start it. Mr. Adam, you may begin.
Okay, so first of all, I'm looking at a passage here that is it's Billy talking to Montana. So we can assume that perhaps they're in Tralfamadore. Billy, this is an important passage because Billy is essentially telling in very succinct and very clear terms about what happened during the bombing of Dresden. A lot of this ties with the theme of witness and truth. All of Billy's life, it's as if he's trying to understand what happened at Dresden because he's always struggled with that. Mm-hmm. And this also deals with the metafictional aspects of Kurt Vonnegut himself, who was a veteran of the bombing of Dresden. And essentially he wrote this book as a way to make peace with his experiences of the war and kind of uses Billy as a vehicle. That also deals with the theme of sci-fi, why Vonnegut chose a sci-fi story. If you look at compare it in Vonnegut's, Vonnegut is well known for being a sci-fi author, and I think a lot of times he's using sci-fi as a way to understand reality, our contemporary reality. So I think that's very important to understand from this passage as well. When we look at this story, Billy starts talking about, even here in the first main paragraph here, there's a couple of things that are very important. Number one, he mentions the barbershop quartet. The barbershop quartet is a very important symbol to the story because the quartet is always made a parallel to the German guards that were guarding Billy during the bombing. And I take the quartet as kind of just this overarching symbol of the grief Billy feels, because when Billy first saw the barbershop quartet during the wedding anniversary of him in Valencia, he sees the barbershop quartet and it makes him weep. And a lot of that is that he's weeping because it reminds him of the German guards. It reminds him of all the people that died during the bombing, whereas Billy and his fellow POWs were spared. And I think Billy, as well as Kurt Vonnegut himself, the author, they feel so much grief because of that. Because that's the great irony of the title Slaughterhouse 5, is that although they were spared, although they got to survive the bombing, many innocent people did it. In fact, even in that same paragraph it mentions here, told her about seeing little logs lying around. There were people who had been caught in the firestorm, so it goes. So what this means here is that people were probably, the local people of Dresden were living peacefully, and then all of a sudden they were just bombed to Kingdom Come, and unfortunately died. They were casualties of war. And did they have to be? No, they were innocent. Dresden was not an important military target for the Allied powers. But of course, the Allies wanted to end the war as quickly as possible, as they would later on, as with Japan and Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Kind of the same idea here is that we want to end this thing, so if we have to bomb innocent lives, so it goes. We'll do that. To go along with the great tragedy. And also, what's interesting here is that throughout this story, Billy always mentions that the bombing of Dresden reminds him of the surface of the moon. So here we're seeing another kind of sci-fi convention, or using something that would normally be for sci-fi association with the moon. And I think what Vonnegut is trying to communicate is that while Dresden looks like something that could be out of a sci-fi story, this is actually very real. So again, it's using some kind of sci-fi convention to actually show what is reality. And Vonnegut mentions at the end of this passage how, or towards the end, there was to be no moon men at all. And I take that as, even though this is something that looks like out of a sci-fi story, this is very real, and this was done by humans. But where's the humanity? In my opinion, Vonnegut is questioning the humanity that led to this bombing. Can human beings really be so? Can they disregard humanity so much and look at humanity as so unimportant that they could just bomb and kill a bunch of hundreds of thousands of people and not really see the long-term consequences, or not really see the awfulness of it? So,
Okay.
yeah.
All right. So you talked about how Billy's talking to Montana Wildhack, and on Billy's wedding night, Valencia, his wife, asks him about the war, and he basically says nothing. But now he's opening up to Montana Wildhack about the war and describing it in detail. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it could be satirical, the satirical component of the story. It could be also absurd. I think the idea, Valencia and Billy to me are very much a satire of the heroic couple.
Sure.
Billy is a satire of the war hero. And when we think of Hollywood war heroes, they're always very handsome men. Valencia, of course, very fat and unattractive. So I think there's a satirical aspect to that, and I also think it deals with some kind of the humorous part where Billy doesn't really want to talk to his wife, but he'd rather talk to his replacement wife, Montreal Famador. This kind of she's not an adult film star, but she's kind of like a starlet kind of person, Montana.
Yeah. Why do you think Montana Wildhack is included in the story? Why someone like her?
Maybe because that's what Billy's idea of what a woman should be. That's and also, throughout, there's always these like artifacts and mementos that are reoccurring throughout Slaughterhouse Five. So it mentions in one part of the story where Billy, I think his son Robert was reading a magazine and Montana was in it.
Right.
So then, all of a sudden, she reappears later on while Billy's on Montreal Famador. So it's the idea too that there's these recurring elements throughout the story that not just Billy becomes unstuck in time, but other things will become unstuck in time too. Also, for example, like the photo of the pony that becomes unstuck in time, that Roland had shown.
A lot of these images, absolutely.
Yeah, mementos and images, people. In some ways they become unstuck in time too.
Okay. Want to talk about, you mentioned this idea of ending the war as quickly as possible, and the last line of this excerpt is, the idea was to hasten the end of the war.
Yeah.
What is Vonnegut saying about that philosophy? Because we hear about it a lot, that philosophy of ending a war as quickly as possible is the best way sometimes because we don't want it to drag out.
Right.
What would Vonnegut say about the idea of doing that?
Well, I think Vonnegut would have said that why bother to begin with? If you want to end this as soon as possible, why are you even doing it to start with? And, at this point, the war had been going on in Europe for, 5-6 years. So why even go to war? If you want to end it so quickly, then why were you going to war and bombing for 5-6 years prior to this? I think he would be very critical, just as when this came out, this was also written during the Vietnam era, this book. So I'm sure he was very critical of that. In fact, Billy, I think there's a strong implication that Billy was not happy with his son, Robert, becoming a Green Beret. Based on some of the language that Billy uses, Billy is kind of just very passive and ho-hum about the idea of Robert being some war hero, because the idea of a successful soldier means you had to kill a lot of people, or you were involved with the death of perhaps innocent people, and that doesn't sit well with Billy or Kurt Vonnegut for that matter.
Speaking of those American soldiers, you mentioned this a little bit, but the irony of the American soldiers shooting at Billy and other Americans.
Yeah, that happens.
What's the significance of that?
Yeah, I think what Vonnegut is trying to communicate is kind of the inhumane aspect of war. and how war just makes monsters of us all, and the brutality of it, where these allies, they don't realize that they're shooting at their own countrymen,
Right.
and because they're just so fixated with ending this war.
Right.
And I think it's the psychological impact that war does to people, that there's no innocent people, that everyone, in order to achieve your goal, people must die, and there's no stopping that.
Yeah.
So
I think that makes sense to. They've been dehumanized, and also
right.
that
And
idea.
they've been trained to be.
They've been trained, and you mentioned a lot about the imagery of the moon.
Yeah.
That perhaps is, it's unrecognizable on
Right.
land. So.
Right. It's
Okay.
become alien to them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One more question I had was earlier in the book, we hear that Mary says, writing an anti-war book is like writing an anti-glacier book. It's useless. So, or writing, yeah. So, do you think, can literature be effective to end wars? I know you believe this is a very good book, but
Sure.
Can it be effective to end war? Can literature have an impact?
Well, I think that's kind of the ambition that Vonnegut put into this novel. This is a novel about Vonnegut coming to terms and coming to peace with his own war experience and the guilt and grief that he feels with it. And I think Vonnegut wanted to create literature that would show, hey, you know what, we haven't really learned from anything. We haven't really learned from our mistakes. We need to learn and perhaps not do this anymore. We need to kind of change our social behavior so that we're not putting ourselves in a position where we feel we have to go and kill people in foreign lands. Do I think that literature can help people see the error of wars? The optimistic side of me would say yes, it would. But just like Vonnegut, I think Vonnegut was pretty pessimistic himself, and I think there's also a pessimistic side to me that says, no, maybe, because again, it's just like history. A big theme is about history repeating itself. That how much are we really learning from our past? I don't really know. I think about today. I wrote that poem about Afghanistan, and a lot of that, reading this book kind of influenced me. Is the United States has been in Afghanistan for 20 years now, nearly 20 years. What have we really learned from the experience? What do we as a people, as the American people, what did we really get out of that? You think about Vonnegut when he was reading this, wrote this during Vietnam. What did the American people really get out of invading Vietnam? I want to say that yes, we can learn, but I think especially the American people, they've just become so immune and tone deaf to the reality, and we've just become so accustomed about this kind of military-industrial complex that it's just become part of the American way, and it's a shame. I think it's pretty brutal, and I think it's pretty sad, but I don't know. I'd like to think that maybe, we can learn little by little. I'd like to think that people will smarten up to it. So.
Good answer, I think. Yeah, Vonnegut's been described as a optimistic pessimist.
Yeah.
So, kind of what you said there.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to switch gears. We're going to talk about the EB theme of identity.
Okay.
And I want to talk about identity and language. So the first question I have would be, what ways does language shape our identity?
Well, in a lot of ways. I mean, language is a part of our identity because it's how we learn to communicate, and that's how we learn about our We learn about our culture through communication. We learn about each other through communication. It's tough. I mean, it's pretty broad, but I think.
Sure.
Language is the way that we can learn about each other. Well, we first have to use language to learn about ourselves, I think. And then after that, then we can start learning about each other, especially if we become versed in other forms of communication, other languages. Then it can help us learn about each other's culture, and I think that's really important moving forward, especially in this kind of multicultural, globalized society we live in now.
So you mentioned multicultural, globalized society. Do you think it should be compulsory for students to learn 2 languages in school?
Yes, I do. I think it'd be good. I'm not the biggest fan of saying students have to do this. Students have to do X, Y, Z as part of their curriculum, but I think ultimately it won't hurt the drawback to that is that not everybody can learn languages at the same pace. I think that's what education has to understand, is that if you implement this idea that, okay, well, everybody has to learn at least, IB, for example, everybody has to take 2 language courses. I don't think you can expect equal balance about everyone's going to learn languages equally. I think some people have a stronger propensity to learn languages better than others. We've seen that as teachers.
Sure.
So I think as long as there's that expectation, I think that's fine. But I don't hate the idea. I'm not against the idea of saying that everybody has to take, has to learn a second.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
The idea of people being caught between 2 culture, you mentioned culture and language are intertwined. The idea of people being caught between 2 cultural identities, partially due to language. Can you give some examples of the idea of being caught between 2 languages, and what do you think of that?
Sure, I'll just give you my own personal experience. So, as you know, my parents are Cuban immigrants. Growing up, they spoke Spanish. For me, when I was a kid, I didn't really speak a lot of Spanish as a kid. It wasn't really till my adult life that I really started to learn more Spanish and speak more Spanish, and I had a more of ambition to do it. But as a kid, I felt very distant towards my heritage and my culture a little bit. I didn't feel like I had a strong connection because I didn't grow up in that culture.
Sure.
The Cuban/Spanish culture was very alien to me, and I felt kind of insecure about it as a child. And I felt kind of insecure because, for example, my grandparents, they don't always speak English, but I could understand if they spoke Spanish to me, but I really couldn't communicate with them, and I would be mad at them or mad at myself if they tried making, making jokes at my expense in Spanish and stuff like that. Things like that would irritate me. Now I can see that, well, it was just because I wasn't really ready to embrace my kind of cultural heritage. And it's okay now because now I can communicate and it's not a big deal, it's not a problem. And I'm very happy with that, but I can understand that maybe if you're growing up kind of with 2 different cultures, being rooted in 2 different cultures, sometimes it could be difficult choosing one over the other. And I think ultimately maybe you end up falling back on the more dominant one. So in this case, the American English-speaking culture was the one I grew up in, and the kind of Cuban Spanish-speaking culture was one that over time I had to kind of get used to.
Do you feel, you mentioned little sidetrack, but do you feel like your identity has been more influenced by your family or your outside experiences?
I want to say it leans a little more towards my family. I think sometimes, for example, the way I work, the way I approach work, I think that's very much family influence.
Sure.
My personal beliefs and kind of social political beliefs, I think a lot of that is due to family, but I think partly is due to experience as well. I think everybody is initially, when it comes to maybe social beliefs, I think initially a lot of people are influenced by family, but over time the experience will shape them.
Right.
So I think it depends. It depends.
Sure.
I think it's fairly mixed, but I do think I think sometimes the family is more influential than people might think it is.
Right. It's a broad question, but since you brought up the influence of your family, I want to bring that up.
Sure.
One more question about language that I had was, what effect, I want to talk about language extinction. There's languages, we lose a lot of languages every year. What do we lose when we lose a language, and should there be effort put into preserving languages, or does it make sense for more people to speak the same language? What do you think of that?
Yeah, that's a tough one because I think the dying of languages, I think number one, it's kind of a natural occurrence because the thing is, if you're someone that wants to believe in science, some cultures do end up dominating. Some people do end up dominating, and cultures will die out because of that. I don't think it's necessarily because of malicious intent or anything like that. I just think it's just a naturally occurring biological happening.
Right.
So, should there be an effort to preserve languages? I don't think there's any harm in it. I think it really depends on the people whose culture/language is dying. If they're the ones that really want to preserve it, then I think they should be allowed to. if people from the outside want to make a big effort to preserve it, I don't really know if that matters as much.
Why not?
Because it's not their culture, it's not their language. I think ultimately it's up to the people that want to preserve. Now you could argue that the stronger, more dominant culture should make an effort to preserve those minority cultures.
Maybe they might not have the means to.
Maybe they don't have the means to, but I think they can work together on that. But I think ultimately the onus has to be on the culture / language that's kind of being phased out in favor of something that's more dominant. I think there has to become from a genuine desire from that particular language / culture that wants it to keep on going. Does it matter? Well, I don't know, because honestly we're heading towards the more tech-based we get, the more robotic we get, the more automated we get. Ultimately, I don't know, I think all time, maybe you could argue, it sounds very sci-fi, but maybe all forms of oral communication will eventually all die out and everything will just be digital and it won't really matter. So I think if you're thinking, thousands of years in the future, hundreds of years in the future, does it really matter? Maybe not.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
All right, buddy. Maybe not.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
All right, buddy. Hopefully that was pretty clear. We went a little bit longer, but that's okay. Kind of got a basic gist of how we do this, the 3 parts to it. So just a reminder, the first part is you presenting on an excerpt from whichever novel you decide to do. And then the teacher will ask you questions based on your presentation. And then finally, that third part, we'll be doing a Q&A on some of the IB themes. I normally do usually I do 2. I think this time we only did 1 identities, but sometimes I'll do 2.
Yeah.
I do identity sharing.
It's usually 1, but it kind of where it veers off, I think it's just a...
Yeah.
But yeah.
If you want anything else.
No, have a great summer, everybody.
Yeah, enjoy.